Welcome to this cozy exploration today. We're going to look back at a seemingly short but actually really impactful clash, the War of 1812. You had this young United States facing off against, well, the British Empire.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Right from the start, you see this ambition in the newly independent U.S. They'd just won their freedom, but they were already looking to expand across North America.
Yeah, westward ho, basically.
Exactly. But of course, the map wasn't empty. You had France, Spain still around, and critically, a major British presence up in Canada.
Right, and you can imagine the British weren't exactly thrilled about losing the 13 colonies. There was definitely some lingering resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And one way they pushed back, sort of indirectly, was by, well, arming various Native American tribes.
Oh, creating a buffer.
Precisely. A buffer against American growth, keep things unstable on the frontier. Maybe it served their purposes, limit American expansion, maintain some influence.
And then, just to stir the pot even more, you've got Napoleon running rampant in Europe.
Yeah, the Napoleonic Wars. Huge backdrop to this.
So Britain hits back with this massive economic blockade against France. And you might think, okay, Europe's problem, but no.
No, because Britain's orders in council basically said neutral ships, like American ones, couldn't just sail to French-controlled Europe. They had to stop in Britain first, pay duties.
Which was a direct hit on American trade, American shipping, their economy.
Totally. Britain was trying to strangle France economically, and American ships just got caught in the middle. A lot of resentment building up there, economic pain.
Yeah, absolutely. And that economic pain, plus that desire for more land, it really fueled the rise of the war hawks in American politics.
Oh, the war hawks, yeah. Mostly younger guys, right, from the South and West.
Exactly. Very nationalistic, really anti-British interference. And they saw opportunity. Canada, maybe Florida.
They were pushing hard for war, weren't they? A real contrast to some of the older, maybe more cautious politicians who remembered the revolution.
Definitely. It felt like a new generation asserting itself, this idea of, well, American destiny.
Yeah, manifest destiny starting to bubble up. And one key figure pushing things on the ground was William Henry Harrison,
governor of the Indiana Territory. And his approach to Native American tribes was, well, aggressive is putting it mildly.
He basically wanted them to submit, sign away land. His policies were all about clearing the way for American settlement.
Which naturally led to resistance. And that resistance really found a focus in one man, Tecumseh.
A remarkable figure. Shawnee leader, about 42 at this time.
And his vision was quite powerful, wasn't it?
It really was. He saw that individual tribes fighting alone were just going to be picked off. He argued for unity, for a confederation.
Not just to resist, but maybe even reclaim lost lands.
That was the dream. He traveled all over trying to build this coalition, the Pan-Indian Alliance against American expansion, a real diplomatic feat.
But while Tecumseh was away doing this diplomacy, Harrison saw his chance.
He did. He marched on Prophetstown,
which was like the capital of Tecumseh's confederacy.
Right, and Harrison didn't just capture it. He burned it to the ground.
And crucially, they found British weapons there.
That was the smoking gun, wasn't it, for the Americans anyway? Proof, they thought that Britain was actively backing the native resistance.
It really hardened opinions back east.
Definitely galvanized people, pushed them towards war.
So you've got the ships being seized on the high seas. You've got Britain seemingly stirring up trouble on the frontier. President James Madison, he'd had enough.
Yeah, he laid out the grievances to Congress.
And in June 1812, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain. A huge step for such a young nation against a global superpower.
A massive gamble, driven by economics, land hunger, and this perception of British interference.
Okay, so war is declared. What's the first move? Well, the Americans had this grand plan: invade and conquer Canada.
Seems a bit optimistic in hindsight, doesn't it?
Well, their thinking was, Britain's tied up with Napoleon in Europe, so Canada will be lightly defended.
And they also thought the French-speaking folks in Quebec might actually welcome them as liberators.
Yeah, that was a miscalculation.
A big one. They underestimated the British presence. But maybe more importantly, they underestimated this growing sense of Canadian identity, even loyalty to Britain in some areas.
So the invasion plan was three-pronged. Attack Detroit out west.
Right, near Lake Erie, control the lakes.
Attack the Niagara region.
Cut Upper Canada in two.
And then a push towards Montreal.
The main artery, really. Makes sense on paper, hit them on multiple fronts. But the execution...
That was the problem, the forces involved. It wasn't exactly apples and apples.
No. Canada might not have had Britain's full might, but they had experienced leaders like General Isaac Brock.
Whereas the Americans, well, they don't really have a big standing army. Lots of militia.
Resistance soldiers, yeah. And some of the commanders, like General William Hull, leading the Detroit attack. He was, what, 58? Retired?
Not exactly inspiring confidence, maybe?
It shows the difference. Britain had this professional global military machine. The U.S. was still figuring things out, wary of standing armies. That lack of professionalism hurt them early on.
But the British had a key ally, didn't they? Tecumseh.
Absolutely. Tecumseh and General Brock formed this alliance based on mutual respect. They both saw the U.S. as the main threat.
A shared goal. Stop American expansion.
And that alliance worked. Right at the start, too.
At Detroit, the combined British and Native American forces basically spooked General Hull.
He surrendered his whole army without much of a fight, really.
An absolute shock for the Americans. The first time U.S. forces surrendered on U.S. soil to a foreign power.
Huge psychological blow. Showed the British-Native alliance was serious and exposed American weaknesses right away.
Okay, so Detroit's a disaster. What about the second prong, Niagara?
Queenston Heights. That also went badly for the Americans.
Initially, they got across the river, right? Gained some ground.
They did. And ironically, General Brock, the British commander, was killed really early in the battle.
You'd think that would help the Americans.
But then Native American reinforcements arrived. And they really turned the tide. Their fighting, plus the fear factor for the inexperienced American militia. It led to another American defeat. Costly for the British losing Brock, but a major setback for the invasion.
And the third attack towards Montreal.
That one just fizzled. Poor leadership, logistical problems, generals apparently squabbling. It never really got going.
So 3 invasion attempts, 3 failures, not a great start on land.
No, it really highlighted the problems with American command, coordination, and just the sheer difficulty of moving armies around back then.
But surprisingly, while the Army was struggling, the U.S. Navy was actually having some success.
Yeah, out on the Atlantic. Against the Royal Navy, no less.
Which was unthinkable, right? The Royal Navy ruled the waves.
Exactly. These ship-on-ship victories, like the USS Constitution beating HMS Guerriere,
Yeah.
they were stunning. Didn't change the war strategically, maybe, but the morale boost, huge.
A bit of good news amidst all the land defeats.
Definitely gave Americans something to cheer about.
Meanwhile, back out west, William Henry Harrison is still in the fight. He launches this campaign, and it sounds pretty brutal.
It was. Burning native villages, reports of massacres, a real scorched earth approach.
But his own army suffered terribly too, didn't it? From disease.
Typhus, yeah. Ravaged his troops. Shows how harsh the conditions were, the human cost on all sides. That Western Front was particularly nasty.
And the British and Native Americans hit back too. There was one incident after a British victory, a massacre of American prisoners.
There was. But then Tecumseh stepped in.
To stop the killing.
Yeah. It's a telling moment, isn't it? Shows his sense of honor, maybe, compared to the brutality that's happening elsewhere, a different set of values.
Interesting contrast. But overall, the Americans just kept trying and failing to get a foothold in Canada, especially around Niagara.
Right. The Niagara frontier just saw battle after battle, really bloody stuff. Canadian defenses held. The British and their allies were effective there.
It seemed like a stalemate. But then a big shift happened on the water again, Lake Erie.
Ah, yes. Oliver Hazard Perry. We have met the enemy, and they are ours.
A decisive American naval victory. And that was huge, wasn't it? Because it cut British supply lines.
Absolutely crucial. It basically forced the British out of the Detroit region. They had to retreat.
And Harrison's army was right on their heels.
Control of the lake gave the Americans the upper hand in the West, set the stage for another key battle.
The Battle of the Thames, sometimes called Moraviantown.
Right. And this one was decisive. The British commander, Proctor, he fled pretty early on,
Leaving his allies behind.
abandoning Tecumseh and his warriors. And in that battle, Tecumseh was killed.
The end of his dream.
In the end of any effective, unified Native American resistance in that whole region, really. A devastating blow. His Confederacy just collapsed after that.
Many tribes surrendered to Harrison soon after, a real turning point, paving the way for more American expansion.
Absolutely. The power dynamic shifted fundamentally in the Old Northwest.
But even with Tecumseh gone and the West looking better for the U.S., that dream of grabbing Canada just wouldn't die, would it?
No, they tried again. Another big invasion aimed at Montreal and Quebec.
Still hoping the French Canadians would join them.
Seems so. Still misjudging the mood up there. And still struggling with the basics.
Like logistics, leadership.
Yep. Generals Wilkinson and Hampton. More questionable leadership. And surprise, surprise, the French Canadians weren't rolling out the welcome mat.
Wasn't there a story about a Canadian officer, Salaberry?
Colonel de Salaberry, yes. With a much smaller force, mostly French-Canadian militia, he managed to turn back a larger American column, became a Canadian hero, showed the local resistance was real.
So another invasion fails. This is getting repetitive.
It really was. Though there were smaller actions, like an American raid on York, what's now Toronto. They burned some buildings.
And the British retaliated.
Yeah, burning some American towns along the border. The destruction just kept escalating, tit for tat.
But through all these failures, the Americans were learning something, weren't they, about their military?
They were, the hard way. They realized they couldn't just rely on militias. They needed a professional, trained, standing army.
A big mental shift for them, given their founding ideals.
Absolutely. The early war years really forced their hand on that.
And by 1814, this revamped American army was doing a bit better, wasn't it, back in the Niagara region?
Yeah, they won some tactical victories, showed improved discipline and leadership, but they still couldn't make a decisive breakthrough into Canada.
The Canadians and British held the line, still largely a stalemate there.
Pretty much.
But then the whole world situation changed. Across the Atlantic.
Napoleon. Finally defeated in Europe.
Which meant Britain could suddenly turn its full attention and its experienced troops towards America.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of veteran soldiers freed up from the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy, less constrained. Things suddenly looked much more dangerous for the U.S.
And Britain didn't hang about. They started launching raids on the U.S. East Coast.
Led by Admiral Cockburn. Pretty aggressive campaign.
Burning towns, infrastructure, and also freeing enslaved people.
Yes, that was part of it. Thousands were freed. And interestingly, some of them actually joined the British forces, formed units like the Colonial Marines. A complex situation.
And the most dramatic point of this campaign, Washington, D.C.
The capital itself, captured by the British.
And they burned it. The Capitol building, the president's mansion.
The White House, yeah. Incredible moment.
Yeah.
You have Dolly Madison famously saving that big portrait of George Washington just before the British arrived.
Imagine that. The enemy marching into your capital. A huge national humiliation for the U.S.
Definitely a low point. And a symbolic victory for the British.
So with the war dragging on and Washington burned, they were trying to negotiate peace, right? In Belgium.
In Ghent, yes. Negotiations have been going on for a while, actually. And initially, with Napoleon beaten, the British felt pretty confident. Their demands were tough.
Like what?
They wanted the U.S. to give up territory, particularly in the Northwest. And they pushed hard for creating a large, independent Native American buffer state in the Midwest.
Wow, basically carving up U.S. territory.
Exactly. Protecting their Canadian interests, protecting their former Native allies, limiting U.S. power.
But then, the momentum shifted again. Back in America.
It did. The British launched a major offensive down from Canada into New York, led by the Governor-General, Prevost.
Aiming for
control of Lake Champlain, cutting off New England potentially, but they were decisively beaten at the Battle of Plattsburgh.
Another crucial naval battle on the lake.
Yep. The American fleet won control, and Prevost's land invasion stalled and retreated. Big setback for the British. Prevost was actually recalled in disgrace.
Okay, so that offensive fails. And then another British attack.
On Baltimore. They bombarded Fort McHenry for hours.
But the fort held out.
It did. The attack failed. And that defense, of course, inspired Francis Scott Key, who was watching from a ship, to write a poem.
The Star-Spangled Banner.
Which eventually became the U.S. national anthem. So, a military failure for the British, but a huge symbolic moment for America.
So these defeats, Plattsburgh and Baltimore, they must have impacted those peace talks in Ghent.
Absolutely. They weakened the British negotiating position considerably. They realized conquering large parts of the U.S. wasn't going to be easy or cheap, and Britain was war-weary, wanting to focus on sorting out post-Napoleonic Europe.
So they dropped the big demands. No ceded territory, no buffer state.
Exactly. They basically agreed to return to the situation before the war, status quo antebellum.
Okay, peace treaty signed in Ghent, December 1814. But the news didn't travel fast back then.
Not at all, which leads to one of the most famous and maybe ironic battles of the war.
New Orleans, January 1815.
Andrew Jackson leading a motley American force, regulars, militia, pirates, free men of color, against a large, experienced British army.
And the Americans won, decisively.
A stunning victory. Huge casualties for the British, very few for the Americans.
Even though the war was technically over?
That's the irony. The Treaty of Ghent had already been signed. But the battle cemented Andrew Jackson as a national hero.
And it really shaped the American memory of the war, didn't it? Like,
Yeah.
this victory forced the British to make peace.
That became the popular narrative, yes. Even though the timeline doesn't quite fit, the victory felt like a triumphant endnote, proof that America could stand up to the empire. It boosted national pride enormously.
So when the dust settled, what was the actual outcome? No borders changed hands.
Status quo. Neither side really achieved their main war aims. The U.S. didn't conquer Canada. Britain didn't cripple the U.S. or create that buffer state. You could call it a draw.
But it wasn't without consequences. For Canada, it was huge, right? Forging an identity.
Definitely. Defending their land against invasion, that shared experience, it really helps create a sense of being distinct from the United States. A foundational moment for Canadian nationalism, even though full independence was way off.
And the burned president's mansion got rebuilt and painted white to cover the scorch marks.
Becoming the White House, a visible reminder.
But if we're talking about winners and losers, the real losers seem clear.
The Native American tribes, absolutely. Their British allies basically abandoned them in the peace treaty. Tecumseh's dream was dead.
They were left facing relentless American expansion, alone.
Exactly. They lost land, lost power, lost the possibility of that unified resistance. The war accelerated their displacement and dispossession. There's that heartbreaking quote from one leader saying it would have been better to be killed outright than left to the mercy of the Americans.
Just awful. And when you look ahead, by the late 1800s, the U.S. had spread across the continent.
Pretty much coast to coast. With Canada remaining independent to the north, a direct legacy in many ways of its successful defense in this war.
So a war that ended in a draw had these incredibly profound, long-lasting consequences, shaping the future of 3 nations, really.
And tragically ending the hopes of many others. A complex conflict with ripples that are still felt today.